They smiled into our living rooms, played heroes, told jokes, read the weather, spun records. For decades they were trusted, beloved, untouchable, until the mask slipped. This isn't a tabloid exposé. It's a walk through the polite, televised nightmare that Britain tried to forget. Behind every applause was a secret. Behind every familiar face, something darker. These aren't rumors. These are convictions. And once you've seen who made it on this list, you might never look at old TV the same way again. This is the horrifying secret life of 21 classic British entertainers. And yes, it's all true. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into the stories that were never supposed to come out. We drop long-form mysteries just like this every week. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it on your end? Midnight? Noon? The middle of a restless 3 a.m.? Let us know in the comments. We're listening. 1. Leslie Grantham. Before he was EastEnders' most notorious landlord, he was inmate 469073. Leslie Grantham, beloved by millions as the charismatic Dirty Den, wasn't just playing a villain. He was living in the skin of a man who had already taken a life. And unlike the usual TV arc, the redemption here was off-screen, silent, and mostly erased. In 1966, at just 19, Grantham shot and killed a German taxi driver during a botched robbery attempt while stationed with the British Army. The man died. Grantham was convicted of murder and served 10 years. And then, he came home, quietly slipped into acting school, and emerged reborn. Not as a reformed killer, but as the nation's most watched soap villain. For decades, most viewers never knew the character they loved to hate was being played by someone who'd already done both. It would have been a twist too melodramatic for even the BBC to write. The man playing the soap opera's most scheming criminal had been convicted of actual murder. But this wasn't fiction. This was Britain, where charm, class, and a coat of media-friendly politeness could scrub almost anything. When the truth resurfaced in the press, it was met with a strange cultural shrug. After all, he'd done his time, hadn't he? That's the line we like when the face is familiar. That's the moral salve applied when a killer has good diction and a slot on the Christmas special. Still, there's something ghostly about watching old episodes now. The swagger, the eyes, the oddly credible menace, as if the performance wasn't crafted, just remembered. But Leslie wasn't the only respectable face whose reality unraveled into something quietly horrific. And unlike him, the next man didn't wait for fame to come after his crimes. He downloaded his darkness between takes behind closed doors and straight into infamy. 2. Chris Langham. The public thought they were watching intellect, complexity, a man of gentle British wit with a tragic squint, perfect for serious drama and self-effacing comedy. Chris Langham played the kind of roles that required empathy, and got it. He wrote, he acted, he even won a BAFTA. He made people laugh with dry scripts about power, shame, and media corruption. Irony loves a man like Langham, someone who could speak moral decay fluently on screen while hoarding something darker just off it. In 2007, the curtain was yanked down. Langham was convicted for possessing child abuse material. Not rumors, not tabloids. Courtroom, evidence, guilty verdict. His defense? He said he was doing research, for a role. A claim that somehow made everything worse. As if the crime could be rebranded as performance art. As if the courtroom was just a particularly grim writer's room. Langham served his sentence. Public life ended like a switch had been flipped. No farewell tour, no slow fade into retirement, just silence, the kind that doesn't want applause. It's the silence of knowing the most articulate man in the room had no words left for what he did. Today, his name lingers in a strange cultural purgatory. The kind you don't Google at work. The kind people half remember in pub conversations before someone mutters, "Wasn't he done for something?" And the room changes shape. But the British entertainment world had barely taken a breath before another story dropped. Same crime, same shadow. But this time the man wore the face of a dependable sitcom dad. A character you could trust your kids to. The kind who said, "Don't worry, love," while the cameras rolled. If you're still with us after that, you're exactly our kind of viewer. We do deep, disturbing, and often uncomfortable stories like this every week. So hit subscribe if you haven't already. And tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Are you wide awake or trying to fall asleep to the sound of something quietly horrifying? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who's out there. 3. Robert Hughes. He was the steady man in the background. The neighbor, the uncle, the guy with a cardigan and a joke that didn't quite land, which made it all the more disarming when he did. Robert Hughes built a career on likability. He played roles designed to lower your guard. And that's exactly what he did. Hughes became a household name through Hey Dad, a long-running family sitcom with all the warmth and paper-thin morals of its era. Audiences across Australia, and many in Britain, knew him as the bumbling father figure. But beneath the dad jokes was a man already operating in grotesque contradiction. In 2014, decades after the laughter faded, Hughes was convicted of multiple child sex offenses. He was sentenced to over 6 years in prison. His trial revealed a double life not hidden in shadows, but standing squarely in the frame. Children were harmed while Hughes was being broadcast into living rooms, while the credits rolled, while parents assumed their screens were safe. There's something unusually cruel about this kind of betrayal. Not just the act, but the placement. The gall of hiding inside a role designed to disarm. It forces us to ask a question entertainment isn't built to answer. What if the character we trusted was the mask? His co-stars described feeling gutted, audiences disoriented. The legacy of the show has been swallowed by what came after, as if the entire sitcom now plays under a blacklight, every laugh contaminated by hindsight. And yet, the industry machine kept turning. One actor down, another ready to fall. Next came a young star with a clean-cut smile, a teenage soap idol, a face for posters, a name parents once approved of, until they couldn't. 4. John Alford. Once upon a time, John Alford was what British telly loved best. A charming young lad with a bit of swagger, a heart of gold, and enough cheek to keep the aunties watching. From Grange Hill to London's Burning, he carved out a career built on playing the good guy, the kind of face you'd expect to help your nan with her shopping, not end up in a courtroom. But then came the unraveling. Slowly, messily. Alford's public image began to blur in the late 90s with tabloid stings, whispers of cocaine, and those inevitable quotes from friends close to the actor. Still, what arrived decades later made all that look like warm-up material. In 2025, John Alford was found guilty of sexually assaulting underage girls. Not gossip, not innuendo. A courtroom verdict, final, cold, and devastating. The man whose face once grinned from teen magazines was now being described in court documents no one wanted to read out loud. The verdict didn't just end his career, it warped every frame of his past work. Watching him now feels eerie, like rewatching a children's magician after learning he stole the rabbit and buried it. There's a specific discomfort reserved for betrayals that take years to surface, especially when the betrayer once played a hero. Alford faded from screens and from cultural memory, the way a song disappears from the charts and no one wants to sing it again. But the industry wasn't done exposing the strange dual lives of its minor stars. Next came a man less known for scandal and more for salesmanship, a former actor who swapped lines for lies and discovered crime didn't just pay, it paid commission. 5. Philip Foster. Philip Foster wasn't exactly a household name, more like a household blur. One of those faces you'd half recognize from a soap or maybe a late-night rerun. The kind of actor who blends into plot lines, plays a bartender with 2 lines, or turns up as detective number 3 on a Tuesday night. But in the end, it wasn't his acting that made headlines. It was his talent for manipulation. By 2025, Foster had ditched the stage and embraced something far more lucrative. Fraud. Big cinematic fraud. The kind of scheme that would have made a great TV drama if he hadn't starred in it off-screen. He posed as the gatekeeper to fame, running bogus modeling agencies that lured in young, hopeful women and drained their wallets in the name of building their portfolio. The charm that once earned him background roles on telly now became his weapon. Clients were promised stardom, studio sessions, exclusive gigs. What they got was debt, false hope, and an expensive folder of headshots. Foster, meanwhile, got a prison sentence and a reputation more notorious than any role he ever played. There's a particular irony in actors becoming con artists. Both professions require a straight face, a convincing tone, and the ability to sell fiction as fact. Foster wasn't the first to figure that out, but he might have been the most shamelessly enterprising. Still, his crimes were financial, calculated, cold. What came next wasn't clever or cunning. It was darker, more desperate. A soap star with a familiar fatherly presence, the kind you'd expect to steer clear of trouble, instead plunged headfirst into something criminal, messy, and violently real. 6. Brian Regan. If you ever watched Brookside in the 90s, you knew the face. Terry Sullivan, working-class hero. Always in a bit of a mess, but nothing a pint or a hug couldn't fix. Played by Brian Regan, he was the kind of character you rooted for. Flawed, but lovable. A soap staple. But the line between character and actor didn't just blur here, it shattered. Years after his TV days faded, Regan became entangled in a criminal underworld plot that was as far from the scripted chaos of Brookside as you could get. No cue cards, no retakes. In 2012, he was convicted of helping conceal the murder of a known gangland figure, perverting the course of justice. A charge that sounds like a plot twist, until you realize it wasn't part of a drama. This was real. And Regan wasn't acting. He played a part, yes, but not the kind with credits at the end. He withheld evidence, misled police, and tried to clean up a mess no amount of screenwriting could justify. Why? Maybe it was money, maybe loyalty, maybe ego, maybe just a tragic spiral from forgotten fame to dangerous company. Whatever the motive, the fall was brutal. From fan-favorite soap regular to convicted criminal, wrapped up in a case that felt more line of duty than Brookside, and yet the pattern held. Familiar face, dark secret, comfortable smile, uncomfortable truth. But the next name on the list wasn't a background player or a late career dropout. He was once the very definition of suave, all velvet suits and cigarette smoke, a TV icon of masculine mystique. And beneath it all, a charge that would all but erase the myth. 7. Peter Wyngarde. There was a time when Peter Wyngarde didn't just walk into a room, he slinked. All velvet blazers, slicked back hair, and arching eyebrows. On Department S, and later as the impossibly cool Jason King, he was the very model of flamboyant masculinity. He didn't just play a ladies' man, he invented one. But behind the carefully curated persona of seductive charm and cigarette-smooth confidence was a life less composed, and a reputation that would quietly detonate in 1975. That year, Wyngarde was convicted of gross indecency in a public setting, a scandal that, in the world of 1970s British television, didn't just derail careers. it vaporized them. Though the offense didn't involve violence, the social context made it professional poison. The charm turned radioactive. The scripts stopped coming. The velvet jackets were no longer ironic. Wyngarde never quite recovered, professionally or publicly. His later years were marked by obscurity, patchy interviews, and a sense of a man out of sync with the century. He never fully denied the charge, nor did he ever confront it with any sense of clarity. He simply folded the incident into his mystique, just another thing he didn't explain. His fall wasn't about the details alone. It was about the clash between image and reality, between the man on the posters and the man in court. The star who made a career out of being desirable became, in an instant, the subject of whispered jokes and industry exile. But if Wyngarde's descent was about contradiction, the next case was about something colder. A man with a rising career, a few high-profile films, and a quiet sense of promise. Until a courtroom in Scotland shut all of that down, with one verdict and no punchlines. 8. Kevin Guthrie. Kevin Guthrie had what casting directors love: a likable face, an easy voice, and just enough presence to be both forgettable and familiar. He was in Sunshine on Leith, popped up in Fantastic Beasts, and seemed to be riding the steady wave of a mid-tier acting career, a kind of low-key success that British cinema quietly builds. Then, in 2021, he disappeared from screens for a reason no agent could fix. Guthrie was convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a sentence later reduced but never erased. His name became a headline, and then a cautionary tale. Just like that, the warm smile and everyman charm turned into something viewers now flinch at, even in old reruns. What makes Guthrie's fall especially jarring is how fast it happened. One moment rising actor, the next convicted criminal. No long history of scandal, no public unraveling, just a sudden and irreversible shift in public narrative. For an industry that thrives on redemption arcs, Guthrie's story left no room for comeback. The curtain didn't fall, it was yanked down mid-scene. There's also something especially disturbing in the timing. His career had just begun to hint at longevity. The idea that a man on the verge of broader fame could be living such a contradictory life, with a secret that would destroy everything overnight, it forces a reconsideration of how we gauge character from the outside. And yet, as disturbing as that is, the next figure on this list makes all of it look small. Because the man who follows didn't just commit crimes. He built an entire persona around trust and charity, only for it to collapse into the most devastating betrayal in British broadcasting history. 9. Jimmy Savile. He was the nation's eccentric uncle, gaudy, grinning, all teeth and cigars. Jimmy Savile wasn't just famous, he was embedded, knighted, adored, host of Jim'll Fix It, marathon runner, charity fundraiser, friend to royals and hospital wards. He was the blueprint of British eccentric fame, strange, loud, untouchable, and he used every inch of it. For decades, Savile operated with impunity. Whispers existed, of course they did, but nothing stuck while he was alive. He kept institutions close, police at bay, and the media carefully misdirected. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a myth, a man who seemed too public to hide anything, and too bizarre to question deeply. Then came the collapse. After his death in 2011, a wave of revelations broke. Police investigations, victim accounts, official inquiries. It was no longer rumor. It was an avalanche. Hundreds of allegations spanning decades, all pointing to one horrifying truth. Jimmy Savile had abused his fame not as a shield, but as a tool. What makes his case uniquely disturbing isn't just the scale, it's the complicity, the people who looked away, the producers who shrugged, the hospitals that handed him keys. It's the slow, dawning realization that someone so visible could also be so invisible, because we didn't want to look too closely. Even now, years later, his story hangs like smoke over British media. It forces the question, who else did we get wrong? Who else wore the smile, shook the hands, raised the money, and left something unspoken in their wake? The answer, unfortunately, was already queued up. The next name wasn't as loud, but just as insidious. A man who once sang to families, and was later convicted for the kind of crimes that silence every melody. 10. Rolf Harris. At one point, Rolf Harris could enter a room and instantly melt the temperature. He had that warm, wobbly voice, the offbeat humor, and a persona that seemed practically engineered for daytime telly and children's specials. He was a painter, a musician, an entertainer. A man who'd been granted the cultural hall pass to show up just about anywhere, from royal portraits to cartoon segments to sing-alongs with primary school kids. But the version of Harris that the public clapped for wasn't the version that would eventually stand trial. In 2014, the illusion disintegrated. Harris was convicted of multiple counts of indecent assault, with a sentence that echoed like a warning through every corner of British pop culture. He wasn't just charged. He was unmasked. Publicly, formally, and inescapably. The betrayal hit hard. Not because he was above suspicion, but because he had, for so long, floated above consequence. He had the costume of trust, the beard, the chuckle, the catchphrases. His entire persona operated like camouflage. And worse, institutions, TV networks, event organizers, public bodies, gave him platform after platform, long after whispers became rumors and rumors turned into unease. What made Harris's downfall so culturally corrosive wasn't just what he did. It was what it forced everyone else to confront. How often do we mistake charm for character, familiarity for innocence? But Harris wasn't a fluke. He wasn't alone. In fact, right behind him stood another pop-era figure, one who predated the scandal, then returned for a sequel. A man whose name became shorthand for disgrace, and whose real identity had been hidden under glitter, eyeliner, and a stage name that now sounds less like nostalgia and more like a warning. 11. Gary Glitter, Paul Gadd. Gary Glitter wanted to be remembered for his stomp-clap anthems, his platform boots, and the strange, glammed-up patriotism of British pop in the 70s. For a while, it worked. His songs blasted through football stadiums and kids' discos. He was a novelty, a harmless cartoon character who shouted his own name mid-chorus. Unmissable, ridiculous, safe. Until he wasn't. The first crash came in the late 90s, when he was convicted for possession of child abuse images. A shock, but for many it was treated as a footnote. A strange footnote, yes, but not yet the end. Glitter quietly vanished, went abroad, tried to stage a comeback. That was mistake number 2, because it wasn't the end. It was just intermission. More allegations. More investigations. This time abroad, and then back home again. Finally, in 2015, he was convicted in the UK for historical child sex offenses and sentenced to 16 years. This time, there was no coming back. The glam faded. The name became radioactive. Songs were pulled. Radio stations went silent. Even the briefest sound of Rock and Roll Part 2 in the background of a TV show suddenly felt sinister. What makes Glitter's case especially grotesque is how long the persona survived. How many birthday parties and football matches he soundtracked while his real life spiraled into something criminal and hidden. And how long the industry kept booking, airing, and playing him, as if notoriety were just another costume. But even Glitter, with all his cartoonish menace, didn't operate alone. He belonged to a certain era of showbiz, one that rewarded performance over accountability. And from that same television generation came yet another charming face, a man with a bright grin, a BBC contract, and a secret that ended in court documents no one wants to revisit. 12. Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was British television's version of controlled chaos. All booming laughter and cheeky commentary. As the longtime host of It's a Knockout, he made silliness seem noble. With a booming voice and a penchant for dramatic exaggeration, he could narrate adults in silly costumes like it was Shakespeare. Off-screen, he was equally beloved, a cultural staple. He even received an OBE. In the 70s and 80s, there were few TV personalities more recognizably safe. Or so we were told. That facade collapsed in 2013. Hall was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of indecent assault against minors, committed decades earlier. The court documents were bleak, the stories worse than the headlines. What unsettled the public wasn't just the conviction, it was the timeline. The span of time these offenses covered. The years in which no one spoke, no one acted, and Hall kept smiling into the lens as if nothing else existed. Even after his initial guilty plea, further investigations uncovered more offenses, leading to additional sentencing. His OBE was stripped, his legacy shredded. That once lovable voice now echoes differently, tainted not just by what he did, but by the way the system let him keep doing it. Watching old footage now feels surreal. The zany games, the laughing crowds, the affable host who always seemed slightly too delighted by the chaos. It all plays back like a farce turned sinister. And just when it seemed like the archive of disgraced TV figures was finally being emptied, another name emerged, darker, louder, and surrounded by rumors for years. A man who once called himself a friend of Savile's. A name that, when exposed, turned stomachs and headlines alike. 13. Ray Teret. If you knew his name at all before the trial, it was likely in passing. Ray Teret wasn't a major celebrity, more of a supporting act in the peculiar circus of mid-century British entertainment. A radio DJ, a minor TV face, and most notoriously, a former flatmate and close associate of Jimmy Savile. That last detail, once merely trivia, would later read like a warning sign that had always been visible in retrospect. Teret moved in the same circles. He had the same grinning ease, the same man-about-town aura. For years he styled himself as Savile's successor, borrowing the showmanship, the mannerisms, even the haircuts. But where Savile's secrets exploded after death, Teret's came out while he was still alive to stand trial. In 2014, he was convicted on multiple serious charges dating back to his heyday. The case painted a picture not just of individual crimes, but of a deeply disturbing environment, one where ego, access, and silence allowed horrors to play out under the guise of celebrity. Teret, like others on this list, had built a career on seeming familiar. What he hid behind that grin was the kind of truth that makes entire eras feel cursed. And yet, even after the verdicts, even after the headlines, what lingers most is the proximity. The way these men were always just one connection away from each other, always working the same circuits, sharing the same green rooms, laughing at the same parties. Ray Teret didn't work alone. He belonged to a broader pattern, a web of public faces with private secrets, camouflaged by charm. And the next one wore perhaps the safest costume of all, the weather presenter. Smiling, trusted, and always standing in front of a map. Until suddenly, he was standing in court instead. 14. Fred Talbot. For decades, Fred Talbot was a cheery staple of British television. The kind of man you'd see gesturing over a floating map in the middle of a canal, making small talk about low-pressure fronts while school kids waved behind him. He made weather watchable. He made mornings lighter. He seemed, if nothing else, harmless. But behind the forecasts and affable banter was a different version of Talbot, a version that was never supposed to make the news. In 2015, that version surfaced, not through scandalous rumor, but through a court verdict. Talbot was convicted of indecent assaults dating back to his time as a teacher, long before his television career. Later convictions followed, tied to separate offences in Scotland. The public reaction wasn't explosive, it was stunned silence. Because Talbot didn't fit the usual narrative. He wasn't flamboyant or eccentric. He wasn't a larger-than-life figure. He was ordinary, quietly present. The kind of man you'd pass in a supermarket without a second glance. And maybe that was the point. The ordinariness masked everything else. There's something especially jarring about betrayal wrapped in beige. About the idea that someone could stand in millions of living rooms each morning and still carry that weight. That contradiction makes people squirm. Because if you can't trust the man reading the weather, who can you trust? Talbot faded into obscurity, name scrubbed from retrospectives, career buried under the weight of facts. But not all his peers vanished so quietly. The next man held on longer, kept his fans, his voice, even a bit of his brand. Until the day the courts caught up. And suddenly, the deep voice of 70s radio had to explain himself without a microphone. 15. Dave Lee Travis, David Griffin. If you were listening to the radio in the 1970s or 80s, chances are you heard him. Dave Lee Travis, or DLT as he liked to be known, was a giant in British broadcasting. Not just for his voice, but for the peculiar, almost cartoonish presence he brought to everything. He had sideburns. He had swagger. He had the easy charm of a man who believed his own myth. And for years, it worked. He bounced from Top of the Pops to Radio 1, spinning hits, cracking safe jokes, and always acting like the room, or the country, was in on it with him. Travis didn't just present pop culture, he styled himself as part of it. But in 2014, everything changed. After being caught in the widening investigation into historic abuse cases in British media, he was convicted of indecent assault. The charge, though singular, shattered the persona. In court, he came across not as a cheeky national treasure, but as a man unable, or unwilling, to reckon with the line he'd crossed. His sentencing didn't come with the thunder of a long list of charges, but the damage was done. One conviction was enough to collapse a public life built on familiarity and trust. And yet, in interviews, he remained oddly defiant. A man still narrating his story as if the audience might clap at the end. DLT was supposed to be a voice from the past, goofy, loud, and ultimately harmless. But like so many others from that era, he had a private script the public never got to hear, until it was too late, and just when it seemed like the list of disgraced figures had peaked, along came the man who made celebrities famous, only to become infamous himself. 16. Max Clifford. Max Clifford never pretended to be a saint, just smarter than the ones who did. He wasn't an actor, not technically, but he was always performing. Clifford made his name not on screen but behind it, as Britain's most infamous publicist. He controlled headlines, curated personas, and turned tabloid manipulation into an art form. If a scandal could be hidden, he hid it. If it could be sold, he sold it. He built careers from dust and buried secrets with a phone call. He was the man you called when image mattered more than truth. So, it's no small irony that Clifford's own image turned out to be a carefully stage-managed lie. In 2014, he was convicted of multiple counts of indecent assault following a widely publicized trial. The fixer became the fixed. The man who shielded others from exposure was now front-page news himself. Only this time, no spin could rescue him. His downfall wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Clifford didn't just manipulate stories, he shaped the culture around them. He helped create the idea that celebrity could overwrite morality, that charm could outrun consequence. And when the truth came out, it forced the public to ask, how many others did he protect? How many monsters wore makeup because Max wrote the script? He died in prison, still denying everything. But his case left a lingering shadow, not just over media, but over trust. Because Clifford didn't just make others famous, he made the wrong people untouchable. And then came a man who took that untouchability to its logical extreme. Not a spin doctor, but a pop guru. Not behind the scenes, but dead center stage. A man who once discovered stars and ended up permanently blacklisted from his own industry. 17. Jonathan King. Jonathan King was once the crown prince of oddball British pop, a flamboyant eccentric who discovered chart toppers, hosted TV shows, and wore his weirdness like a badge. He gave the world novelty hits, launched careers, and presented himself as a harmless oddity, too quirky to question, too clever to catch. For a time, he got away with it. He cultivated a public image that was hard to pin down, equal parts genius, joker, and provocateur. He looked like someone who didn't play by the rules because he helped write them. But behind that colorful persona was a carefully masked reality. In 2001, it shattered. King was convicted of child sex offenses and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The verdict landed like a lightning strike, not just for his victims, but for an industry that had always treated him as an untouchable eccentric rather than a danger. He had reinvented himself as many times as he changed jackets. But the court wasn't buying it. The conviction didn't stop the myth-making. Even after serving time, King publicly defended himself, questioned the legitimacy of his trial, and insisted he'd been wronged. But no one was listening anymore. The sparkle had dimmed. The songs stopped playing. And the man who once made other people famous had become infamous in a way no producer could fix. What makes King's story feel particularly grim is how long the image held. How far charm, wealth, and access can carry someone, even when the truth is hiding just beneath the surface. But the media's house of mirrors wasn't done yet, because up next was someone who didn't entertain, he informed. A man who read the news with calm authority, until the story turned on him. 18. Huw Edwards. For years, Huw Edwards was the calm in the storm, the voice of reason, the man who delivered news of royal weddings, political upheavals, and national tragedy with the kind of quiet authority that made people feel like, somehow, everything was still under control. He wasn't a star, he was an institution. The last person you'd expect to become the headline. In 2024, that changed. Edwards appeared in court and admitted to accessing indecent images of children. He received a suspended sentence, but the damage was already done. One of the BBC's most trusted faces had stepped over a line so jarring it felt almost unreal. How could the man who guided the nation through breaking news be carrying such a secret? The public response was stunned silence, not rage, not scandal, just a kind of emotional whiplash, because Edwards wasn't part of the flashy celebrity machine. He wasn't one of the entertainers. He was the straight man, the grown-up in the room. And if he could fall, who was left? Even more disturbing was how it forced viewers to rewatch old broadcasts differently. The royal deaths, the election nights, the national addresses, all filtered now through a different lens. A private life that had nothing to do with journalism, but somehow redefined it in hindsight. Edwards quietly stepped back from public life, and the BBC moved on. But for many, the betrayal stuck. Because it wasn't about celebrity, it was about trust. And once that cracks, there's no putting the glass back together. But Huw Edwards wasn't the end of the descent. There were still those who hadn't just crossed lines, they'd obliterated them. Like the actor-turned-judge whose stage career was forgettable, but whose court case no one could look away from. 19. John David Baker. John David Baker wasn't exactly famous. Not in the red carpet household name way. His resume was a mix of minor screen credits, local talent shows, and a stint as a self-styled entertainment judge. The kind who shows up in regional news articles with a forced smile and borrowed gravitas. He played the part of the cultured mentor, the man who knew the industry. He claimed to help others find the spotlight. But behind the scenes, he was operating in the darkest possible shadows. In 2023, Baker was sentenced to 25 years in a U.S. federal prison for the production of child sexual exploitation material, a sentence that didn't just end his career, but erased it. What stunned observers wasn't just the nature of his crimes, but the scale and organization. The man who presented himself as a harmless talent scout was, in reality, orchestrating one of the most severe betrayals of trust imaginable. There was no spin, no ambiguity, no redemption arc. Just the cold, bureaucratic language of the Department of Justice, outlining a case that left no doubt and no room for nuance. His online presence disappeared almost overnight, scrubbed clean by legal consequence and collective revulsion. And yet, even Baker's case fit into a pattern. The small-time performer. The self-anointed gatekeeper. The man who used his vague proximity to fame as a cloak. For all his lack of stardom, his betrayal felt all too familiar. Because power, even in its smallest doses, is still power. And trust, once broken, doesn't care about screen time. But the web of betrayal didn't end with the fringe players. Next came a figure rooted deep in pop culture itself. A name tied to radio waves and retro fandoms with a history so contaminated it required multiple convictions just to tell the full story. 20. Chris Denning. Chris Denning was one of those figures who seemed permanently frozen in pop culture amber. A DJ from the early days of BBC Radio 1, surrounded by jingles, upbeat intros, and a reputation as one of the architects of the UK's top 40 scene. He was part of that golden era when radio still felt personal, and voices through speakers felt like friends. But behind the booth, Denning's real legacy was anything but nostalgic. Over the course of decades, he was convicted multiple times for serious offenses involving minors. The sheer number of cases, stretching across borders and years, paints a picture not of a man caught in one act, but of someone who repeatedly exploited his access and trust. His crimes weren't just heinous, they were persistent. Each conviction seemed to uncover a longer trail. One sentence in the UK, another in Europe, another still years later. He was like a ghost who kept returning to the scene of the crime, each time reminding the world that the past had not been buried. What makes Denning's story especially unsettling is how deeply embedded he was in the cheerful branding of youth pop culture. He helped craft the sound of fun. He worked with stars. He hosted countdowns. His was a voice meant to connect generations. And yet, it now exists only as a reminder of how deeply wrong an era can go when no one's paying attention behind the scenes. He died in prison, with his name stricken from retrospectives and playlists alike. But not before leaving a legacy that rewrote how we think about the innocence of nostalgia. And somehow, even after all this, there was still one more case, more recent, more jarring, and far too close to modern screens. A young actor, a rising profile, and a conviction that shut down a career before it ever really began. 21. Alexander Westwood. Alexander Westwood had the kind of rising star trajectory that makes producers lean in. He was young, photogenic, and modern. His appearance on Sex Education, a Netflix hit known for its progressive themes and sharp writing, hinted at a bright future. He wasn't a lead, but he was part of the cultural moment. A name just starting to enter the casting shortlists. Then everything stopped. In 2024, Westwood was convicted of multiple sex offenses involving minors. Not allegations, not speculation. A court case, a sentencing, a verdict that ended his career not with a scandal, but with legal finality. In an industry increasingly cautious about who it platforms, Westwood's name became instantly unmentionable. What made the case so uniquely chilling wasn't just the nature of the charges, but the sheer speed of the descent. One moment he was featured in streaming promos and stylized cast photos. The next, he was being scrubbed from Wikipedia entries and news feeds. His IMDb page became a digital ghost town, and because the platform was so modern, the disconnect felt even sharper. This wasn't a relic of a different era being reevaluated under new standards. This was current, contemporary. Proof that even now, with all the press scrutiny, all the social media accountability, someone could still make it through the gates of pop culture with a secret that would implode everything. Westwood's story isn't about fame lost. It's about fame never truly earned. A brief, shining spotlight revealed to be completely artificial, and hiding something fundamentally broken underneath. And with him, the list comes to an end. 21 public faces, each one a reminder that the line between persona and reality is paper thin, and sometimes hiding a darkness we'd rather not believe could ever smile back at us through a screen.